Good afternoon. Is this working? Can you all hear me? Fantastic. Okay, thank you very much to the ABH for the invite to speak. Thank you all for sticking with us till the end of the afternoon. There's only one person I can see dropping off in the room, so I shall attempt to wake them up by the end of my presentation. Okay, so my presentation is a story about how Nationwide Building Society turned a basement of forgotten ledgers and forgotten archives into a much-loved, much-valued asset at the heart of its organisation. So it's a story about how an organisation rediscovered its original social purpose and put that at the heart of what it's doing today. Now, that is a photo of me day 2 in my new job. I started working there about a year and a half ago. I'm probably thinking something like, oh my Lord, what have I done? Or just to give the translators a break, I'm probably thinking, Mamma Mia. Okay, so building societies then, for someone who doesn't know what a building society is, and let me tell you a little bit about their history, because then you can understand the social purpose behind them. So building societies took the model of the friendly society, which were formed in the 17th and 18th century, and they were formed when people came together, normally people from the same locality or the same trade, and they came together to pool their resources to solve a common problem. So, for instance, they would pay a subscription into a common fund every fortnight or every month, and then if there was any kind of distress or unemployment or disease or a death, then they would get a particular sum of money to cover those expenses. So that was a model that was set up of sharing funds and solving a common problem. And this model was applied for the first time to building houses in Birmingham in 1775. Or so we think. The actual origins of the very first building societies in the UK are slightly shrouded in mystery and lost in the midst of time. But the story goes something like, the workers were sat in the Golden Cross pub, and the picture is a reconstruction of the Golden Cross pub, because in the UK, obviously, everything always starts in the pub. So they were in the pub, and they were moaning about how they didn't have any houses. So picture the scene. Birmingham is a thriving, growing city. It's the heart of the Industrial Revolution. There's loads of people who have moved into Birmingham, but there are not enough houses to go round, and the houses that are left are being let at high rents. This is a common problem. The workers are complaining, and the landlord tells them, stop complaining, save the money from your next drink into this jar, and when there's enough money in the jar, we'll draw lots, and the person who gets the first lot will get the money to buy a house. So that is how the first building society started. And they kept on putting money into that jar until there was enough money for everyone to buy a house. Now, that's a great model, but it has certain disadvantages. The first obvious one is you could be the last person to get the money from the jar. You could be waiting 20, 30 years to get the money for your house. And the other obvious disadvantage is there's no way to join the building society after it has started, because everyone's already paid in certain amounts of money. However, even despite that, they were very popular. They spread throughout the UK. And as well as there being a social purpose about providing a home, there was also a political purpose to many of the early building societies in the UK. Because to have a vote in parliamentary elections in the UK, you had to have a particular amount of property. And if you could afford to buy a house, then that would give you the qualification to have a vote. So the small extract I have on the screen there is an extract from a founding document of one of these early local building societies. And it says that its object of the society is to improve the social, promote the moral, and raise the political conditions of the industrious classes. And that really covers the social purpose of the early building society movement. So building societies then, it evolved from those early models of the friendly societies. They became much more societies which were permanent, that anyone could join at any time, that balanced out the savers and the borrowers. And up until the end of the 20th century, they had a really strong but niche position in the UK financial services landscape. In fact, they were probably providing about 85% of all mortgages in the UK by the end of the 1970s. And also providing many small savers with a safe home as well. However, in the 80s, there was a change in regulation that brought banks into the mortgage markets, and I'm not going to say too much about this because obviously Olivia is talking about this tomorrow afternoon. But essentially what happened was that banks then started offering mortgages which took that market share away from the building societies. So they in turn moved into banking products. So the pictures on the screen, for instance, is the Flex account, which was the first full-service current account offered by a building society. There was then, of course, the question, if you look like a bank and you're offering banking products, why don't you just become a bank? Well, of course, the thing about building societies was that they were founded on a totally different model, and they were mutual organisations where there were no shareholders, there was no separation between the owners and the customers. So if you were a member of a building society, you meant you had the products of the building society, but you also owned the building society, you had a share, you had a vote in the building society. So it's a very different model to a limited company or a joint stock company. And some building societies wanted to keep that model because they felt that there should be an alternative model in the financial landscape. But some building societies rushed to convert to become a bank, and then, as Karen will tell you in a minute, became taken over by high street banks. There was also a financial inducement to the members of building societies to convert because they would get a lump sum windfall payment. So by the end of the 1990s, you will find the financial landscape has completely changed. There's far fewer building societies, and the Nationwide Building Society is the only real big player left in the field. Now, Nationwide itself had to fight off two battles where they were being forced to convert. And to give you an idea of the scale of the people involved, in 1998 there was a vote to convert Nationwide into a bank. There was also at the same time a referendum in the UK on whether Wales should have its own government. More people voted in the Nationwide Building Society vote than in the referendum on Welsh national government. Anyway, so Nationwide decided to stay as a building society, and that left it as the biggest building society, not just in the UK, but in the world. So, by the time I joined in 2016, Nationwide, although it still had a mutual model, had really kind of forgotten about its history and its heritage. It looked like a bank, it offered banking products, it didn't make much of its mutuality, it had really forgotten where it came from. So in my first week at work, for instance, the head of marketing and advertising asked me when Nationwide was founded, because she didn't know and no one in the organisation knew, and it wasn't something anyone ever talked about. There was a real problem of corporate amnesia in Nationwide, and people needed to reclaim that history. And it was becoming an urgent problem because there was a new chief executive who had decided that Nationwide's mutuality was a real point of difference for the building society, and he wanted to make much more of that, and he wanted to have the archives properly looked after and properly used as a resource in the organisation. So that was when I joined and went and discovered the archives. Now, the picture on here was an exciting moment for me because that is actually the founding document of the parent building society for Nationwide, and it was folded up and just shoved inside one of those ledgers that I found in a basement. So when I found that, I was very excited. I was also very excited when I read on the last page of that document, in the founder's handwriting, that the society should be set up for its members, not for the capitalists. And that was a phrase that we then used over and over again in the building society. But I think the importance of that was that we started with a purpose, and that was what made it so powerful. Now, I had to get my skates on because the chief exec told me, I started in October, that in January he wanted to have an event-wide organisation that every single member of staff was invited to, which they would unleash the new strategy to the staff, and that the history had to play a huge part in persuading the staff that this was the right thing to do. So every single member of staff was invited to Birmingham, obviously, where else? And there was a huge exhibition hall there, and they were talked through the strategy. There was lots lots of, sort of corporate games and events and that kind of thing. But every morning started off with the CEO, who you can probably just about see in that picture, telling our history in 45 minutes, and that was backed up with lots of images from the archives, with stories from the archives, with actual archive objects that he took along with him, and that really underpinned the credibility of what we were saying about the power of the purpose, of the original social purpose of the Building Society. Now, the staff feedback from that event was absolutely amazing. The history section was the one that everyone remembered and commented on, and I've given you a flavour there in one of the quotes. The history is fascinating. It's heartwarming to know our current philosophy is so close to that of our founders. They would be so proud. So we built on that and we created an advertising campaign. So then it became a story we weren't just telling internally, it's a story we were using to sell externally as well. So we created an advertising campaign. Now, it's quite tough to work your history into an advertising campaign, so we did it through the medium of poetry, and you will hopefully see the ad at the end of this talk. So we commissioned a poet to write about the founding of the Building Society, and that ad went out on prime-time Saturday night television in the UK and through cinemas as well. Now, our external ad tracking agency gave us the results a couple of months later, and it had performed better than any other ad in the last 5 years in terms of changing people's perceptions of the brand of Nationwide and persuading both members and non-members that it was a trustworthy organisation. It was backed up with an advertising campaign which used actual items from the archives, and that poster went into every one of our 700 branches throughout the UK. And again, that meant the staff were involved. They were talking to members about the advertising campaign, and members obviously saw that in the front window of every branch as well. Because that was so successful, we've been asked to then put a whole range of new heritage assets into every branch, and there's a couple of sentences you will see that we use all the time, and the message we get over is it's a heritage we're so proud of, it's a purpose we're still committed to. So it's the whole social purpose that we emphasise over and over again. We've also put a visual timeline of the milestones in the events of the organisation down the centre of the head office, so employees can see it as soon as they come to work. And we've taken a humorous approach as well to reclaiming characters from our history. So this gentleman is called Arthur Webb. He was the biggest character in our history, and we created a staff competition around him which had lots of sort of fun fake moustaches, and about 1,000 people in the organisation entered that, and it was a way of making our history fun and engaging and accessible. And there are some other comments. The CEO wrote a blog, "What would Arthur think today?" And again, so those were some of the comments from our staff about how they thought that Arthur would be very proud of what we were doing. He'd be very pleased to see that we were staying close to the original purpose of the organisation. And the advertising campaigns now continue. So if you've travelled in London on the Underground recently, you may have seen some of these posters. So we have looked back at our first mortgage register and found the first family that ever bought a mortgage from us and followed them through, and again created a poem around their story and a large advertising campaign that's running at the moment in the UK. And now I'm hoping we can show you the first ad about our founding.
A black and white empire. London, 1884. The foundries churn out change. There's far more smoke than air. And in this giddy town, far more working heads than places to lay them down. You want your own roof, you better have pinstripes and money to spare. Fortune favors the fortunate, small change there. The butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, who thinks they matter? Mr. Cooper does. Help each other and we all get up the ladder, Mr. Cooper says. We all have a share. We all get a vote. We're in the same boat. Stand together and build. A nation of helpers, a nation of houses with hopers inside. The currency of kindness. Nationwide.